Handball is a hybrid game as it includes elements of football, basketball, netball and water polo. But despite its array of sport and inclusion, it often struggles with funding and participation. The sport is played largely outside the UK and is in fact the second largest sport across Europe. But since 2018, handball in the UK is at its lowest, with only 25,000 participating. James Chadburn is the coach and chairman of Chichester Falcons Handball Club and feels the infancy of the sport is what's holding it back in the UK.
It's a very new sport to this country. Really, it's been around 10 years. A few other clubs have been around a bit longer, mostly up in London. But effectively, it's a very new sport to this country. We're not set up very well for it. Very few places will house actual handball courts. We're lucky here to have such a court where we're playing away. But for instance, so we started our team in Chichester, but we play our league games in Gosport, which is in a different county.
Despite the aim of London 2012 Olympics being to inspire a generation, handball has since had its funding wiped out for elite athletes, while grassroots received double their initial £0.6 million investment. The decision from Handball England to halve the participants in their National University Handball Championship is an odd one, and is something that Vulcans player Joe Bartlett feels will be a hindrance to the sport.
England Handball this year, I don't know if you know, but obviously the Uni Championship's been cut, so there's usually 30 or 32 odd teams that go to nationals. So obviously all the unis get to train out for it, but this year they've cut it down to 16. So obviously for me personally, I'm vice president of the uni team, I know that people want to play at nationals because that's the big tournament, that's the big focal point. If they keep getting rid of the opportunities to play on a big stage, then people won't want to participate. But that's why it's good that clubs like Vulcans are around, because it means that people can play at a higher level. And yeah, like Evan said, it's a family dynamic. It's got a good group of lads, and that's the main thing.
As well as running the Vulcans, Chadburn is also a secondary school PE teacher. Handball isn't currently offered in PE lessons, but is something that, if changed, could be a good starting point in boosting the popularity of the sport.
Although it's on the national curriculum, it's now offered with many secondary schools and with many primary schools. There's a lack of education around it and a lack of knowledge and confidence. So what I'm finding with secondary schools in particular is they're using it as an extra sport for those students that are lacking in sports. They use it as an alternative sport, which is where I've come in and run sessions. But primarily they've been myself without teachers, because they just sort of use it as an extra sport basically.
Not being part of mainstream PE lessons in England is a factor James feels is holding the sport back, and suggests even adapting the sport to get more youth involved.
Made, where sometimes it's just better to show them physically than just give them like a cool card. You know, this is how you can develop a game. PE teachers don't have, many teachers in general, don't have all the time in the world to sit around and just read resources. I feel like there's sort of a market of actually just creating videos for teachers to show, okay, yeah, these are the connections to dodgeball, for instance. These are the connections to other sports. This is how you can adapt handball in a smaller space, multi-gender, different age groups. However, you know, there's lots of different ways you can do it. You use the skills. Yes, it might not be the traditional handball game, but there's plenty of the skills that they could use within that.
John Pearce is part of England Handball and represented Team GB at London 2012. He explains, along with participation levels, venues can also be a problem for many clubs.
The FA and England Hockey, England Handball is trying to push forward an initiative to align our court dimensions. The issue that we have in England is that the biggest indoor court is a handball court of 40 by 20 metres, then with extended runoff. So most community sports halls or most school sports halls, we go off of what's called a four court system, which is a nonsense, because when they say four courts, they mean four badminton courts, which isn't the unit of measurement. So most sports halls, and you may remember when you were back at school, will be four badminton courts, which equates to one netball court of 30.5 metres, where you can fit a basketball court in that. Unfortunately, handball isn't, for the last 30 years, hasn't been on the mind of any developers or schools when they're building their sports halls. So that's a massive issue for us. Whereas if you go anywhere across Europe, well, anywhere not within the Commonwealth, effectively, sports halls are built to a minimum standard of 40 by 20, and then everything else fits inside of it.
Along with the difficulty of finding a suitable venue, handball is also in competition with other activities to actually secure the courts, with participation and money again playing a factor.
Kids parties, bouncy castles, indoor adventure arenas, all sorts of stuff we have to compete with. And again, commercially, you have to think of it this way: if you have a handball training session with 15 people and you're using an indoor sports hall, but then someone organises a birthday party or a Zumba class, and you might have seen it a couple of times where you go in commercial centres or leisure centres where they've got a boxer-sized class or a Zumba class or something, and there's 35 people in there taking up literally a 1 metre squared area each. Your revenue is going to be drastically increased by doing a Zumba class or a boxer size or whatever it may be, in comparison to 15 people trying to play a competitive indoor sport. So these are all the commercial things that go into the fluctuations of our ability to get into venues, which is something we're going to have to really address and think about and be creative in how we adapt to that.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
2020 has been plagued by the deadly coronavirus pandemic, leaving many sports in unfavourable situations. Handball is no different and has left John fearful about the future.
Clubs obviously losing their memberships, and I think all sports clubs in the country, including handball, will face a situation whereby memberships will have stopped at most clubs because obviously they're not training, there's no activity. So it's an extended period of non-activity. So obviously the longer that inactivity continues, there's a higher likelihood or higher percent of people who won't retake up activity once we finish. So that's obviously a concern. Further to that, obviously most clubs have financial responsibilities. Unfortunately, no club in England, well, you could argue it's both ways, but fortunately and unfortunately, no club in England currently within handball owns its own facility, which means that we could completely rely upon renting our facilities when we want to play. Now, that obviously means that there's a bit of flexibility, that we're not paying any tenants fees or land fees, etc. at the moment. Whereas football clubs and rugby clubs that own their own facilities may still have outgoings. So that's a bonus. But then, of course, we're completely reliant upon when venues reopen and the contractual obligations that we have for renting in advance. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
Despite the disappointment of James's Chichester Falcons League being voided, he does believe there are some positives that could be taken from this pandemic.
From this outbreak. And I think the biggest thing, like you've just said, is this video messaging, this video calling. I think we all knew about it, for sure. We did all know about it. We've been using it for years. But I think actually it can be brought further to the front of people's minds if the information is there, if the contacts are there, that actually England Handball could absolutely do some sort of list of qualified, reliable sources that schools can genuinely both email and set up these sorts of meetings. They can just have, even if it's a 10-minute conversation after school. Oh, what's this rule in handball? How can we do this?
Handball, like every sport at the moment, is unsure of what the future will hold. With current government guidelines, it is unlikely that professional and amateur sports may still have more days, weeks and months of inactivity. Handball England still have the aim of completing the current season, even if it means adapting slightly, but the longer time goes on, the more unlikely this seems. The cancellation of the Olympics in Tokyo is a blow to the sport's profile, but with the hard work of those such as James, John and that of England Handball, the sport will bide its time and return stronger than ever.